Hey, this is Cam with Blacktail Studio, and a few weeks ago I showed you how to get a really nice satin finish on this big dining table I made. This week I'm going to do just the opposite and show you a high gloss finish that's really more of like a polished marble or polished granite look. Stay tuned. Sanding is extremely critical, and it is also extremely boring to watch, so I won't make you watch me progress through every single grit, starting at 100 on this table, ending up at 320. I do recommend checking out my blog, and I'll include a link to that in the video description that gives a really detailed dive into sanding though. The finish I'm going to be using here is called Osmo, and specifically 3043 is the number of it, and I don't know why they give so many different numbers to all of their finishes. I don't know why they can't just name them things like Mustang and Camaro, but they give numbers. So there's 3054, 1101, 3043, and they're all really confusing to know which is which. But all you need to know for this one is I am using 3043. That is the only finish I am using on this table, Osmo 3043. You'll notice I am finishing the underside first, and you'll also notice that I go and I essentially wipe off all the excess finish immediately after applying it, which is not how I'm going to apply finish to the top. This is to really remove the bulk of it, because when I flip it over here, I don't want it to really stick to that blanket any more than I have to. It will leave some small marks that you'll need to sand out lightly and apply a second coat, but the main reason is wood movement. And if you only finish one side at a time and leave it overnight, you can get a slight warp or cup to your table because one side is sealed and the other side is still absorbing moisture from the air. So that is why I always recommend finishing both sides consecutively. I am using a white floor pad to buff these in, and you can really use a lot of things. You can even brush it in, which you'll see here in just a second. I switch over to a brush to really kind of work it into the grain. This finish is a lot different than the Rubio finish that you saw me use a few weeks ago. So we are going to actually leave a lot of this finish on, and you'll see when we get done, it's really saturated and it will look really bad, but don't get too frustrated yet. You just really want to get these grains as saturated as you can, and here's what it looks like the next day. Really uneven, really patchy, but this is exactly what we're looking for, so don't fret if yours doesn't look good after that first coat. Most likely you will not be able to completely saturate the grains with one coat, so do what I do, go back, and this time I am only brushing on a second coat. And again, you're going to be really liberal with this Osmo here. It sands really easily. It becomes just really a fine powder when you sand, so don't worry about leaving too much on, which is a little bit different from the old Osmo formula, the 3054. Again, numbers super confusing, but this is what you want it to look like after that second coat. I have a lot of cool stuff in my shop. One of them is those vacuum clamps. The other is the sandpaper storage bin. So if you see anything in here that you're interested in, most likely I have it linked in the video description. Now we are going to knock that Osmo finish down, and this is where you want to be as even as possible. You see there the spots that are really frosted and the spots that look more like wood. We want that to be nice and even in the end, and really you want to alter your sanding pattern up and down one way, side to side the other, round in circles. So just keep it random, and you want to keep going until the table looks as uniform as you can possibly get it. After you get the table as even as you can possibly get it with that 320 grit, this is where it starts to get pretty fun, because the table will start to look really nice. And I have a Bondo spreader here, and I am just spreading it in really slowly just for the video. You don't have to go this slow, it's just being kind of ridiculous, but trowel it in, and this really pushes it into all the grains. And once you get it spread out pretty well, you're going to want to buff it in. And I have a really nice gem buffer. You don't have to use this one, you can just use your orbital sander, and they don't make a pad for an orbital sander, but you can just take these pads that are linked in the video description, cut them down to fit your orbital, and do the same thing that I'm doing here. You'll see me use this light stick a lot, and this is actually one of my YouTube viewers showed me this light stick trick, and it is really handy. You can see there that the wood is not completely saturated, so this buffing is still kind of driving in some finish. In between coats, we are going to go up to 600 grit and sand it again just as even as you can possibly get it. You don't really want any variation. You don't want to see any sanding patterns. With that 600 grit, you can see I really take my time, get the light there at an angle, and then go ahead and buff in another coat just like that last coat. Each time you add a coat, you step the sheen up, and I don't know exactly how much. I would say you probably get about a 10% bump in sheen every time you add a coat after those first few coats kind of have the wood sealed. So sanded with 600 grit, buffing in another one, and you can already see the reflection there. It is starting to look really nice, getting a lot of sheen on it. When you're doing those first few coats, when you're really building the finish, you can leave the excess Osmo on, but when you get to these last few coats, you don't want to apply too much. And you can either apply just the minimum and buff it off. Shouldn't have any streaks, shouldn't have any excess on there. And if you get too much excess, you can just flip that pad over or get a new clean pad and buff off all the excess. You don't want to wipe it with a rag, you just want to buff and buff and buff until you really don't see any finish left. So no streaks, no excess finish left on there. If I didn't mention it or you missed it in the text, it's generally about 24 hours between coats, and really probably down to even 12 hours. You see there the sheen really stepped up because I didn't do any sanding between these last two coats, so just went straight into an additional coat with no sanding in between, and this is where you'll get the most sheen. So if this is the look you're going for, this is where it starts to get really fun. It's still a little streaky, and we're going to fix that in just a little bit though. You shouldn't have hardly any finish left on at this point, but what we are going to do is I take a microfiber bonnet and I wrap it around one of my white pads, and an hour after that last coat I go through and I do an additional buffing, and this really just kind of evens out any of that kind of unevenness that was left from the last coat. And I don't go crazy here, you don't want to strip it off, so just kind of a light buffing, making sure there was no streaks, and checking again with my light stick, thanks to the viewer Mike that recommended it. And right now we are looking pretty good. This is about the look my client was hoping for. A little tip I wish I would have known before I found it the hard way is don't handle an Osmo piece for about a week with your bare hands. You can actually leave fingerprints in the finish that will have to be sanded out and redone. And I learned that because I left fingerprints in one of my tables, and I reached out to Dylan at Black Forest and asked him about it, and he said, yeah, about a week you can't handle these, or you need to handle it with gloves. So thanks to Dylan from Black Forest for that tip, and I hope you guys will save yourself the trouble of making the same mistake that I did. While I still consider this a gloss finish, it's not like a gloss lacquer or an epoxy top coat. It's really more of this polished marble look, and I love it. I think it's super cool because you still can feel all the grain. You don't get that thick plasticky layer on top. So different than a high gloss lacquer that you'd see on like a guitar or a grand piano, something like that. But again, just more of a polished stone look. So really unique, really interesting, kind of a cool finish that you can do in a dusty shop. You don't have to worry about having a perfectly clean environment like you do with a varnish or a lacquer. I'd love to know in the comments which ones you guys prefer. And if you forgot what that other table looked like, here is a quick side-by-side that I shot on my Instagram. The high gloss on the right, satin on the left, and don't let the fact that the other table is super big and super cool sway you. I really want to know which one you guys prefer in the comments below. All right, that is the whole video this week. Start your question or comment with the city, state, or country you are watching in, and that way I will know you watched the entire video, and I promise I will answer all of your questions or comments first. As always, I really appreciate it if you hit that little subscribe button, that little bell up in the corner. Thank you so much, and have a great week.